Hello. Welcome to a track breakdown of the song I just released a couple weeks ago, Agony. Hopefully you've listened to it so you have an idea of what's going on, and if not, and I titled this video in a way that is making you click on it, hopefully you can learn something still. So I want to break down the track, everything I did. We'll just walk through it and go from there. So let's go ahead and get started with the drum. The track starts off with this electronic drum kit. I've been really liking using these because it gives a little bit of a different vibe from the actual regular like live quote-unquote drum. I'm using one of the Ableton pre-built drum libraries, a Clockwork one, and I'm just going in and I'm affecting some of the parameters in here. So like we have an auto filter in here. I think this auto filter sweeps, or maybe it's just taking out some of the high and the low frequency, so that way it's not introducing so much low frequency or high frequency really in this section in the intro, and it's still leaving some like bass to be introduced in the next section. We have a little bit of reverb on top, and then we're using Infiltrator for a lot of these cases. So Infiltrator, if you don't know, it's like basically like an audio distortion like engine type deal. It's kind of similar to like Thermal or Portal by Output, but Devious Machines does this one, and I think it's pretty interesting. So you can go through here and pick a bunch of different presets. I just use a little randomization tool and figure out what sounds good. So if we like listen to the drums and how they sound, and then if I take off Infiltrator, so again, that kind of helps take out some of that low end as well. And then we transition to the next part, which would lead into the actual drum. So for this, I'm using Modern Massive 2, and then I have a lot of drum processing going on here. I probably would process this even more now. Like if this was imported into my newest updated project, there'd probably be even more processing on here. But just as it stands, we're using Modern Massive 2, and I have quite a few different presets on here. So I'm using, or not a few different presets, but a few different drums. So like we're using a different snare on here. The kick is different. Toms. Anyways, I'm not going to go through all of it, but I just have this preset dialed in. It's how I like it. I don't think I'm using any extra mixing in here, but I'm doing everything separately. So if we were to listen to the drums, this is how they sound all processed. Which I think they sound pretty good. But like for my kick, I'm using some EQ, I'm using some transient shaper, I'm using a kick reducer compressor preset, I'm using some EQ for the snare with some compression. The toms, I don't think I'm doing anything, I'm just compressing them a little bit. The spot cymbals, taking out all the high end, same thing with the overhead, taking out some of these frequencies that don't sound good and then compressing them. Nothing on the room mono or the room close, just has the EQ. Room far, again, EQ, compression, crush, taking out all that low end, and the snare reverb taking out like basically everything. And I think I have the volume really low too, yeah, -20. So we're not really using like a whole lot of the like secondary mics, I guess, just a lot of the main stuff. But we just have the digital and the regular drums kind of going throughout the track. The only thing I do drum wise is if you're writing drums in Ableton, and I don't know for sure if I've actually done it in this track, but I think I have. What I'll do is I'll write the pattern, I copy it up from guitar to MIDI, and then what I do is I go into here and I humanize it. And then what I can also do is if you take all of your notes, you can do like a randomize. If you put this to like 9 or 10, it'll very slightly move all of it, so it just sounds like a little more movement, makes it sound a little bit more real. The drums are pretty simple. The only other difference I think might just be like the breakdown drums, but they're all pretty simple. They're about the same. For drums throughout, all I do to give a little more impact is I'll use some simple transitions, and then you use a little transient, which is just like the beginning initial click of the sound. If you solo this, you can hear that's with it and then without. It's just a little tiny click that gives it a little bit more of an impact. And if you listen to the track, I hope that you can kind of hear that, and just hear that I try to kind of introduce a big swell into that sharp transient. Moving forward, well, I guess before we do that, drum bus, a little saturator, and then some full parallel processing. On the actual drums, I'm using some multiband compression too, and then just some limiting. That's literally just getting them to be as loud as possible, making them sound, I guess, more digital in that manner, because that's what I'm used to making, and making them sound as loud as possible. Now for guitars, for what I did for this track is I'm using a instance of Odin 3 of Axure, and then Axure another one. I think this is a higher labor. No, it's just affected differently. And then we have one that does like chords or like just more reverbed out. So for our first one, we're using Odin 3. I don't think I really mess with anything. I just use the DI, and then I'm using some saturation. I don't really think this is doing much. If anything, it's clipping it. And then for the preset, I'm using the Metal 2. I probably turned off these two pedals if they're on, so that'd probably be the only change. And then maybe I messed with some of these frequencies here, but I don't really like to do a lot of stuff within the plugin because I don't like to get in here and dive in if I don't have to. So I just do EQ after the fact. So you can see I'm taking out all this low end, and then I'm taking up some of these harsh frequencies up here as well as up here in this, like, what is that, 8-ish thousand kilohertz. And just by itself, it sounds like this. And it's really quite a simple riff. Axure is going to fill in some of the spaces that the Odin isn't. And for this one, I'm using the Metal 4 preset, and again, probably didn't really mess with too much, but just do it how it sounds good to your ear. And then for this other one, same preset, we're boosting quite a bit of this high end. And all together, well, even if we just sample one, and then if you sample all of them together, so altogether they sound pretty good. Adding in the bass, we're using a actual regular like sub bass underneath everything, and I've stopped doing this because I think it sounds a little bit too digital, but it can sound good if you do it correctly. So I'm just using this itchy sub bass preset in Ableton, EQing out all this high end frequency since we don't need that, and the bass's actual bass guitar is going to be taking out some of that anyways. We just have this pattern going in. Hopefully you can hear that. And then that just plays the same thing that the bass plays the entire time. And in fact, the bass guitar plays the same thing the guitar plays, I would say 95% of the time of all my tracks. So the bass, I'm using the Kraken Hybrid. For this one, I'm using a different preset that I use now. So I'm just using the clean DI, and then we have a ton of distortion going on here. So EQ, we're boosting up that high end, give it like that bass grittiness that you can hear like Gideon or Fox Lake use. We're taking out a lot of that low end. We're using some filtering just to take off like a little bit of like the harshness. And then Camel Crusher is what's adding a lot of grit to the bass. So if we solo it and we take off the Camel Crusher, here's what it sounds like. Add the Camel Crusher back on. We're not really worried about the bass coming through too much because the sub underneath is taking up like all of that like low end fundamental frequency. The bass is just adding a little bit more fullness to the guitars. And again, throughout the track, the sub plays the same thing that the bass plays. The bass plays either the root notes of the chords, or it plays the same thing that the guitars are playing. I think one thing we didn't mention for the guitars is we just have this reverb out guitar. I think this is going to be the same thing. Lead with a butter, one preset. We're using arpeggiator on this one, and then we're using some Valhalla shimmer on here. Mixes at 50. I probably honestly didn't even touch this, but it gives it like some nice like chord-esque elements. And by that, I actually meant to say chorus-esque elements, not chord. So for this one, I originally wanted to get a singer. I ended up just doing it myself. But this was supposed to be like a big old chorus section, but I think I just sat on this track for so long, I wanted to get it done. Last but not least, in the bass section, we just have this re-space. This is just to add a little bit of variation towards the end of the track, give it like more of an outro than just abruptly ending. And this is also so that way, if you listen to my songs back and forth, or in I forget the word, but if you listen back to back, that way it's not just like a song ends really quick and then it starts really quick and your ears don't really get a break. So I added this re-space, and this is the same one I use if you've watched any of my electronic tutorials. It's just this Bass Brother and Serum. I think this is the only instance of Serum that I used, and it's just this Jano patch. I don't know who made this, Cymatics, I guess. The presets honestly don't even matter for this one, but just some type of low-end pad-esque sound that can fill out that space, and I'm using an LFO just to modulate it, so that way it is kind of like a plucking to keep some rhythm, and then it ends to like resolve the track. Now for me, and I think probably a lot of people, the vocal production is a little bit more interesting because nobody cares if you use MIDI drums and MIDI guitar. So getting into the vocals, I have several layers at several different parts of this track, but there is one main layer that basically carries out the entire time. If you haven't seen my how I process my metalcore video, I think this is the track that I use for an example, but there is a ton of effects. So if we go through, we can listen to what this sounds like isolated. So in terms of recording, I'm using an SM7B. I have a cloud, not a cloud lifter, but a dynamite on there. It's similar to a cloud lifter, if you know what that is. I have an SM7B, not an SM7DB, so it is required for my setup. For this, I will run through the effects on here. So I'm using EQ, and you can copy and paste this if you want, or you can get a similar one in my sample pack that's below, or Ableton pack. I'm using some de-esser. Dry wet is at 100%, and then the ratio and the actual threshold, just adjust that to based on how loud you record your vocals. I tend to record mine a little bit quieter so there's no distortion, but also because there's so much different like range when you're doing different styles of vocals, it makes it easier just to record a little bit louder or quieter and then compress it. Camel Crusher is the main kind of sauce on here, so if we turn off Camel Crusher, this is what it sounds like without it. And then with it. For me, when I started doing like my own vocal production, Code Orange was a big, I guess, what's the word, like, oh my goodness, I'm losing my words today. Was a big inspiration for me, and how they process their vocals is just very distorted, and Camel Crusher at the time was kind of what I was using, and I've just kept it in my channel ever since. After that, we're using some more compression just to make sure that distortion is not running wild. Reverb, just a little bit to fill in spaces in between vocals, or just that way the vocals don't abruptly end too quickly. And then Spectrum, just to make sure there's no frequencies like poking out, making weirdness. And then vocoder, EQ. Now the vocoder is cool because if you go into here, so we're soloed already, you can use this voice sing section. So what I do usually is I just have a vocoder basically doubling the vocal, making it sound a little bit fuller. The dry wet is at 3%, so it's just very, very minimal, and the format's all the way down. Just add like a dark tone over it. But sometimes too, if you want to make it sound even darker, if you're working on a layer, you can use this voicing section here and make it sound really like evil. So here's what it sounds like, and I'll just dial up the voicing. So obviously you would tune that in or fill it in based on how you want it to sound. I just have it there kind of for an option, and I'm sure it does a little bit, period, but it's kind of just built into the chain, and then a little bit of EQ at the end just to make it sound how I want it to sound. No EQ, or no low end rather, and then we're taking out some of that high end as well. For the layers, that kind of carries out through the rest of the track, and then I believe this one is just a layer. It's the same frequency or the same effects on the second one. There's a little bit of different going on actually, so I guess we will go through it, and this is the chorus now that I'm thinking about it. But we'll go left to right on here. So we have our pan layers, so it's going to be the same effects on our left and our right, and then we have some high layers too. So I think this is a high. That might be high for some people, but that is my low, and then this will be the high. All together. And this video is in mono, so if you want to hear how it sounds, go listen to the track. But we have some lower, just repeats of the vocals layered in, and then we introduce a high. Sometimes when I felt like it just needed like a little bit more of a interesting character going on during the track. So layers for me, this is literally going only 15 left and 15 right, or 12 left even and 15 right. So not a very hard pan. I probably would have done this harder if I went back and redid this track, but that's what we settled on. And then for a kind of secondary part into this break, we just have basically the same thing, reverbed out a little bit heavier. So this one, the reverb's at 46%, and you can hear it on the vocal. And that's literally just to make it transition a little bit better. So if you listen to it in context. And then I'm also using that same track for like some less harsh vocals, so just some like kind of talking vocals. Break me down again, break me down again. And it just fills it in a little bit more, I feel like. This, every time I listen to this, it reminds me of, what's his face from Of Mice and Men, the Aaron Pauli? No, I think that's his name. That reminds me of him a little bit. Or is it Gillespie? I don't know. Anyways, the only thing I did for the chorus here, and you really can't even tell in the mix unless you're listening on some like really nice monitors, is I have the main vocal doubled, and then I have a vocoder going on it. So I'm basically just taking all the same processing and whatnot. Well, maybe not the same processing, but the same vocal. I added a vocal synth to it just to like actual correct it, which I didn't even do, so I guess I didn't do that. But I have a compressor, some EQ. The vocoder is taking the sample from a synth, which now that I'm thinking about it, we completely tossed over the synths, so I guess we'll get back to that. I'm having this BA1 play the chords, and then this vocal is taking that from the vocoder. So you can do this however you want. I just did it like this, and then I added a bunch of effects just so it sounded a little bit more interesting. So some more infiltrator on here, using the vocal suite on there. We're using some wide stereo because I wanted to pan it a little bit bit wider than these vocals, the screaming vocals, and then EQ, some vocal clarity from Ahi. You could probably go without this, and then some auto filter just to filter this out as it goes. But if you listen to this by itself,
struggle like to find myself within.
so it just sounds like a nice layer to it. It makes it sound a little bit more interesting. I wanted it to sound more like a chorus, and I wasn't going to attempt to sing. This kind of goes out throughout the track, and then for the rest of the track, I think we just kind of keep the same thing. Layering when it needs it, layering highs and lows, and then just layering some left and rights when you really want the impact to be there. So like right before the breaks, I like to do the panned. So this one I actually did pan harder here at the end. So this is 36 and 33, right and left. This is what this sounds like by itself.
That goes on a day, what promises are good.
Again, you're listening mono, so you're not going to hear that super well, but it doesn't, it just sounds really wide in headphones or whatever. Again, go listen to the track. Now, I guess last but not least then, let's go ahead and tackle the synth. So I'm using some crackle vinyl pop at the beginning. We're using some oversampled, a lot of EDM atmospheres and stuff that I use. So this is an E, but what I do to make them fit is I use chroma and I change it to the whatever key I'm in. So it's usually C, Phrygian dominant. So I do that. So if you listen to it without it, and then with it, makes it sound like a little more spooky. For BA1, I'm using the same thing where I'm copying the same sub pattern that we had up here, and this is just like a little pluck type deal. And then again, those chords, these are from BA1, and I'm using the buttery smooth pad. And these stay the same throughout the track, just automating some volume stuff as I bring stuff in. We have another duplicate of the chords. I think this is an arpeggiator. Had this like BA synth line come in. Contact, one instance, I'm using the free orchestra library, I think. For this one, the free orchestra 2, and I'm just using the Sol Tasto strings. And then for that last one, I'm just using this child home piano, again, from Ableton. So if you're not noticing the pattern, I'm using, I would say limited tools for this, or at least I'm using a lot of the same tools. So maybe like 15 or less things, you know, that are actual. So you can, you know, make a I would say pretty decent track with not a lot of things. You can have one drum library, you can have one guitar VST, you can have one bass VST, and then I'm using a lot of stuff from Ableton, one synth or two synth VSTs, and then you can kind of go from there and make a full-fledged track. But overall, it's pretty simple. I would say the last thing is in the processing, I'm using the Munson EQ, and I use this on every one of my tracks. This is just to make sure that the frequencies that our ears sound weird to our ears are tamed. I'm using some ozone. I think this is like a preset I'm already using from a different track. So threshold is set at 9. You can take a look at like the different things if I flick through them. But this is literally just to get the track loud. I don't think, I'm sure my dynamics sound like doo-doo, and quite frankly, it doesn't matter to me because nobody actually cares. I think if you have a loud track, that might get somebody to listen to your track more so than if your dynamics are perfectly perfect. So that's the whole track. Hopefully you've listened to it before, and I'm hoping that if there was something that you're curious about, I answered it. It was a pretty like quick and dirty run through of the track, and hopefully you saw, you know, how we do things if you wanted to emulate it, or if there was something that you wanted to copy, hopefully you learned how to do so. That was my stomach if you heard that. Okay, with all this being said, thanks for checking out the walkthrough, and we will see you again on the next video.